In our last episode, Coast to Coast Chaos, New York and LA sparked the American punk revolution. We saw how punk rock grew naturally out of 60s garage rock, influenced by bands like the New York Dolls and Iggy and the Stooges, and we saw, for the most part, how it started on both coasts. But really, the story is much older than that. Like everything we've ever talked about here on the show, punk rock sprang from the blues. In today's episode, we're going to travel around the world to witness how the punk revolution crossed oceans and continents to become a global movement. And we'll see how music that started in a few slightly less than savory bars and clubs in New York and LA became a vital force helping to change the world. This tour begins in the deep south of the United States. On this hot and sticky night, you're a fly on a wall in a dimly lit shack on the outskirts of Clarksdale, Mississippi. The Delta night presses its weight against the flimsy walls of the juke joint, a stifling heat that mingles with the reek of stale sweat and spilled liquor. A solitary kerosene lamp casts flickering shadows across the uneven floorboards, where a meager audience shuffles, their faces etched with the same weariness that clings to the air. A lone man is nursing a half-empty bottle of rot gut at the chipped counter, his eyes vacant. Across from him, there's a couple, huddling in the corner, their movements slow and languid. The woman tracing a tired rhythm on her partner's arm. And the only other soul with any life is an old man, perched unevenly like a buzzard on a school near the back. His gnarled fingers tap out a counterpoint to the music. Robert Johnson sits opposite him, hunched over his guitar like a man possessed. His fingers dance across the worn strings, a blur in the dim light. The guitar, a battered old thing held together with spit and hope, whines under his touch. The sound, slightly out of tune, notes muted from the dullness of the strings, and only amplified by the closeness of the space fills the room. It's not a melody. It's a sobbing, aching wail. A blues so deep it scrapes bone. Johnson's playing his new song, Hellhound on My Trail. In this music, he's pouring every ounce of fear and desperation that he's ever known. His voice, rough as sandpaper on wood, rasps the lyrics. Johnson is singing about what it's like to be chased, like a stag being hunted, because that's been his life in the South, where the predators are white men in sheets. This is 1920, but it could also be 2020 or 2024 down there in the old MAGA South. This is Tupelo. This is Ferguson. Each note vibrates through the air thick with the sense of impending doom. The slide on Johnson's finger whines against the strings, mimicking the mournful howl of a hound dog in the dead of night. The rhythmic strumming of the open strings pulses like a frantic heartbeat, driving the song forward, almost like the sound you hear wild dogs or coyotes making while they chase their prey. The sparse audience seems to shrink further into themselves as the music swells. The man at the counter flinches with each wail of his guitar. The couple in the corner stop their swaying. Their eyes are wide with shared apprehension. Even the old man in the back, his usual stoicism shattered, leans forward, his gaze fixed on Johnson, hypnotized. The thick, stifling air in that ramshackle jute joint crackles like a tension that threatens to burn the very walls of the place. This isn't just music anymore. It's an exorcism, a desperate plea, a man wrestling with his demons and laying his soul bare for all to see. Protest messages have always been important in music. Any art form that sprang from slavery would have to have that in its DNA. It's deep in the blues, and that heritage is carried through into everything that's ever come after it. We saw a little of that last month when we talked about the dead Kennedys.
I'm sitting alone, singing the blues.
Iggy Pop, probably the grandfather of punk, started in music as an inspiring blues drummer. In an interview back in 2009, he said, stuff like Bucka White and John Lee Hooker, well, that's the basis. That's the Rolling Stones, that's Cream, that's even Sonic Youth. In fact, it's very close to Sonic Youth. It's everything that happened in rock, right up from Chuck Berry through alternative. That's the vocabulary there. So you can take a deep dive in the blues if you go back and listen to episode 7 of the American Song Podcast, The Duality of the Blues, from 2021. A link is found in today's show notes for you. So the roots of punk are also in the old Negro spirituals, the plantation work songs. These same songs got picked up and used again later during the Civil Rights Movement in songs like We Shall Overcome. Check out episode 12, also from the 2021 season. R&B was born on the American song River. And again, there's a link in the show notes today. So it's no coincidence that Mississippi, the state with the highest number of post-Civil War lynchings, is also the one most renowned for its blues. Not that both blues musicians and lynching victims were overwhelmingly black, male, and working class. Fear of lynching was a dominant part of everyday life for Southern blacks, and the blues became a form of release from the pain and the violence of oppression. For black musicians, having the blues went way beyond just feeling sad or low. Feeling the blues was a state of crushing, hopeless despair, a sensation so deep that people felt physical pain. The African-American author Richard Wright is remembered as the most influential black author of the 20th century. In his autobiography, Black Boy, he wrote that organizing with other blacks to fight white oppression was hopeless. He was born on September 4th, 1908 on a Mississippi plantation 22 miles east of Natchez. All his grandparents were slaves. Today, there's a plaque in Natchez marking his birth, and he'd have found that probably pretty ironic, seeing as his childhood had been a bitter, terrifying experience. Abandoned by his father, when he was only 5, he got shuffled to different family homes in Mississippi, Arkansas, and finally Tennessee. By 6, he was chronically drunk. Starting when he was very little, he was mentally and physically abused by white employers. He never graduated from high school, and blues became the one way that an oppressed people, surrounded by enemies on all sides, could somehow share their experiences and a tightly veiled outrage. As Wright wrote, outright black rebellion could never win. If I fought openly, I would die, and I did not want to die. News of lynchings were frequent. Mary Ellison is a senior lecturer in the Department of American Studies at the University of Kiel, England. And she's an expert on African American culture and about the blues. And she said, when songs are sung about oppression, whether it's channeled through racism, poverty, or brutality, they're elementally dangerous because they're exposing the reality of situations that those in power would prefer to be masked. Songs that strip away illusions and show things as they are subversive simply because they tell the truth. In societies structured around discrimination, nothing is more subversive than the truth. So outrage is a thing that blues and punk have in common. We heard it in the last episode in songs by the Dead Kennedys and the Black Flag. America's teens and young adults had a lot to be angry about. We'd lost a really unpopular war. The post-war economic good times had skidded into stagflation and unemployment. Crime syndicates were in league with police departments. The cities had turned into war zones. Families were splitting up. School kids were practicing duck and cover under school desks. And no one knew what tomorrow would look like. As John Lydon from the Sex Pistols wrote in that song, God Save the Queen,
God save the Queen. She ain't no human being. There is no future in England's dreaming.
while punk tried very hard to distance itself from tradition, there's no getting around the fact that, like most of the music from America, it's still another offspring of the blues. So what do you say we get out of here and let's go across the water, see what's happening in Europe? First up, England. To tell the story properly, I really need to first tell you about a guy named Richard Hell. In our last episode, we met an English guy named Malcolm McLaren. Mal was managing the New York Dolls for the last few months of their career, and during his time with them, he had also come in contact with Richard Hell. Punk was still an underground movement, and Hell was the musician who created the look and the attitude that thousands of punks followed just a few years later. Hell, whose real name was Richard Myers, began as a poet, and had actually had some of his stuff published in Rolling Stone. Hell came from Kentucky, and he'd run away from home. So would I if I'd had to live in Kentucky. And was living on the beach in Florida when he met another guy named Tom Miller, who later named himself Tom Verlaine. Cooling on poetry, he turned his attention to rock and roll. The two of them made it to New York City, and their first band was called the Neon Boys. It gradually morphed into a bigger band called Television. Now, you'll remember Patti Smith. We talked about her in the last episode. See, at the time, she was a rock critic for the Soho Weekly News. She wrote a few really positive reviews for Television. It was while fronting them that Hell created his look and stage presence, and this was the thing that got McLaren all fired up. Hell wore his hair spiky and his clothes torn. He often used safety pins to hold his clothes together, and as a fashion accessory, too. On stage, he was wild and threatening. He was sarcastic, and he antagonized his audience. Hell's best remembered for the band he launched in '76, Richard Hell and the Voidoids. In '77, they released the album Blank Generation, and to this day, critics list this album as one of the best in early punk.
When you get a face, it's fascinating to observe what
So the Voidoids were Ivan Julian on guitar, Bob Quinn on lead guitar, Mark Bell, who was later Marky Ramone in the Ramones, on drums. And this track that we're playing right now is called Blank Generation. It's really the standout of the album. Let's talk about the song. In it, Hell casts himself as the song's central character, and his birth is a central action in the song. So with his life's first breath, the cartoonish delivery doctor tries to kill him by strangulation. Hell sings that he himself is God's consolation prize, which is a prize you earn for not winning. So the insinuation is that this newborn's first breath shows that God didn't win. Hell also undermines the doctor's authority by making him crazy. So in the autobiography, Hell is telling the world that he was created by an imperfect God and delivered by a crazy doctor who failed in his attempt to strangle him as he drew his first breath. In essence, maybe things would be better if he didn't exist. Now we bring in Malcolm McLaren, who's going to choose Hell as his prototype for English punk. Back in England, McLaren and his business partner, Vivian Westwood, had a fashion clothing store which catered to a very niche, i.e. fetish-crazed clientele. McLaren imagined an opportunity to create an English punk band that he would manage, and one that would also help him market an alternative look and lifestyle that he thought would appeal to London's urban teens at the time. Hell's provocative edge was dangerous. It promised chaos at every level. As it gained momentum in England and eventually around the world, these style elements formed a coded message that shocked the mainstream but uniquely spoke to England's youth, who felt isolated and hopeless in the face of increasing joblessness, changing moral standards, and the rediscovery of poverty. In short, they were acting out their experiences of Britain's decline. As Bernie Rhodes, who was the manager of The Clash, another band we'll talk about in a few minutes here, put it, I was listening to the radio in '75, and there was some expert blabbing about how if things go on as they were, there will be 800,000 people unemployed by 1979. While another guy was saying that if that happened, there would be chaos, there would be actual anarchy in the streets. This was the root of punk. The punk subculture in Britain was a high-decibel, angry push to restore working-class values in British rock and roll. English teens were responding to the terrible economic conditions that had gripped the nation by the mid-'80s, and McLaren saw a business opportunity in it. Compared with what came from America, British punk had a much harder political aspect to it. You can hear how pissed off the working class were at Margaret Thatcher's government. English punk was about upending the status quo that young Brits were forced to live with. This was protest music every bit as much as the blues and R&B and soul in America had been in the decades before it. Punk became a counter-movement to Britain's decline. McLaren handpicked the members of his manufactured band and even named it the Sex Pistols. He started with the band's two actual musicians, Steve Jones and Paul Cook. McLaren then added his clothing store's shop assistant, Glenn Matlock, to play bass, and John Lydon, a poor, green-haired Irish teen who took the lead singing position. He chose the stage name Johnny Rotten, a reference to the decayed state of his teeth. Last in was John Beverly, who called himself Sid Vicious, who replaced Matlock on bass. Their goal? To create chaos and anarchy to overthrow the British system, which in the eyes of the band had failed. The band only ever made just one album, never mind Bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols. And by the way, for guys that don't know British slang, bollocks is a term that was used for balls, as in like your dog's balls. It was ironic that Sid was the last in, since he was also, unfortunately, the first to go after he died of a heroin overdose following a short jail sentence connected with the death of his girlfriend, Nancy Spurgeon. Anyway, every song on the album is a call to anarchy. For instance, this song, which was a vehicle to spread the band's anarchistic ideas. Your basic call to overthrow the British monarchy and Queen Elizabeth II. Take, for example, the song God Save the Queen. Within the first two lines of the first verse, it's pretty clear that God actually saving the Queen is pretty much just exactly the opposite of what the Sex Pistols actually wish for her. And you can get a pretty good sense of what these guys were like from this interview from England's The Today Show from December 1st of 76.
They are punk rockers. The new craze, they tell me. They're heroes, not the nice, clean Rolling Stones. You see, they're as drunk as I am. They are clean by comparison. They're a group called the Sex Pistols. I am told that that group have received £40,000 from a record company. Doesn't that seem to be slightly opposed to their anti-materialistic view of life?
More the merrier.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, tell me more about it.
Fucking spent it, haven't we?
I don't know, have you?
Yeah, it's all good.
Tell me more about
We
it.
fucking spent it, haven't we?
Really?
Down the boozer.
40, really? Good Lord. Now, I want to know one thing. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach and Brahms have all died. Really? What are we saying, sir?
Wonderful people.
Are they?
Oh, yes, they really turn us on.
What do they do?
Well, suppose they turn other people on.
That's just their touch to it.
Which one?
Nothing, a rude word. Next question.
No. What was the rude word?
Shit.
Was it really? Good heavens, you frightened me to
Oh,
death.
all right.
What about you girls behind?
He's like your dad, isn't he, this geezer?
Are you,
With your granddad.
are you worried or are you just enjoying yourself?
Enjoying myself.
Are you?
Yeah.
That's what I thought you were doing.
I always wanted to meet you.
Did you really?
Yeah.
We'll meet afterwards, shall we?
You dirty son. You dirty old man.
Well, keep going, Chief, keep going. Go on, you've got another 5 seconds. Say something
You
outrageous.
dirty bastard.
Go on, again.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a fucking rotter.
Well, that's it for tonight. The other rocker, Abel, and I'm saying nothing else about him, will be back tomorrow. I'll be seeing you soon. I hope I'm not seeing you again. From me, though, good night.
With this one interview, the band created a national scandal in Britain. They were supposed to do a national tour with the Damned and the Clash right afterwards, but public uproar was so intense that the tour couldn't be run as scheduled. Tons of shows had to be canceled, and even the tour bus was denied access into some towns when angry citizens and public officials barred the roads.
How do you react to your group's reputation as being the most revolting in the country?
I find it very amusing. There's no way it's a bad example, it's an extremely good example.
And yet it's said that you're sick on stage, you spit at the audience and so on. I mean, how can this be a good example to children?
Well, people are sick everywhere. People are sick and fed up of this country, telling them what to do.
But not getting paid for it.
Pardon?
But not getting paid for putting on that sort of public show.
Well, nor are we. We ain't even being allowed to play.
In fact, you're acting as spokesman for the group today.
Yes, indeed.
Have you stopped them from talking to us?
Not at all. They're just so disgusted by having to answer so many questions about something so simple. I don't think it's been damaging, far from it. Whether it's helping us is another matter. The point is, people are getting very discontented by the fact that kids who have bought and purchased tickets of these venues that are now being cancelled or having to travel further afield to see the band of their choice.
What sort of future do you see a band like the Sex Pistols having? A long future?
I do indeed. I think at least they're standing up and not tolerating any form of censorship in their act. And in that sense, it's exhilarating a lot of young kids around the country and giving them confidence to stand up and say what they want.
Would you not agree in any way that the packed halls which you're playing to wherever you can get a concert launched are entirely due to the bad publicity which you've had?
Not at all. Many dates were sold out long before.
How do you react to the reputation that your group is the most revolting in the country?
Look, our group is creating a generation gap for the first time in 5 years in this country, and a lot of people are feeling genuinely threatened by it. If the kids want to buy the record, it's called Anarchy in the UK, it's out in the shops, they can make their own decisions. And their mothers, they can ask them to equally make their decision about it. And if the mothers care anything about their young kids, they should be up in arms about having counsellors, of which they are paying taxes to tell that to be angry with them about not allowing their kids to go in the concerts and making their own choice.
Like the Pistols, The Clash were also a band from London. Active from 76 to 86, they survived the rapid rise and even faster fall of the punk movement because, much like the Beatles had in the 60s, they were able to change the style with every album. Their third record, a double album called London Calling, is their most seminal work. So good, in fact, that it was ranked number 8 of the 500 best albums of all time by Rolling Stone magazine back in 2011. Most of the band, except for Joe Strummer, came from lower middle-class families. Joe was born into the family of a British Labour foreign minister and was raised in several different nations. Sadly, his brother died by suicide in 1971, and Joe began squatting in various abandoned houses in London. He eventually joined a pub rock band called the 101ers. Simonon and Jones came from broken homes in London. Heaton was raised in a more stable family environment in Dover. Like the Pistols, The Clash were very political from the very start. As a movement, punk was very critical of the commercialism that saturated the music industry. The Clash were no different. Interesting, since they were both under contract with CBS Records for 10 albums. Their stance reminds me of the song Radio, Radio by Elvis Costello, where he sings,
I wanna bite the hand that feeds me. I wanna bite that hand so badly. I wanna make them wish they never said. Some of my friends.
Now, this song we're playing is called Complete Control, released in the UK as a 7-inch single and in the US on their first album. Totally, it describes the antagonism they felt towards the music industry. They'd always been against what they call bourgeois values. As a band, they stood for the working class. These values earned them critical acclaim and a reputation for being the only band that matters, and for writing songs that were music worth fighting for.
There was a moment where the world stopped. I mean, everything just stopped. 1976, 1977, suddenly ideas became more important than guitar solos. And a certain integrity became more important than driving a Rolls Royce into a swimming pool. Rock stars were like Greek gods. You were lucky to be in the room with them. All that came to an end after the Clash. There was a feeling that if the Clash could do it, you could do it.
Robert Christgau wrote for the Village Voice in the late 70s, and in one review he said, "In 1965, we loved the Beatles, the Booleans, but found that we wanted and needed the cautionary, hard-edged, rather dangerous irony of the Stones, while in 1977 we get off on the Pistols' promise to tear it all down, but find that the Clash help us imagine what it might be like to build it back up again." The Clash believed that anyone could change the world, and this is what made them unique and revered. They railed against the injustices in society, the government and the system, but they still held the door open for the creation of a better system and a better future. In my mind, they were miles ahead of the Sex Pistols and their tear it all down, but we've got no better options mentality.
Distant echo of faraway voices brought in faraway trains to take them home to the ones that they love and who love them forever. The grey 30 steps repeat my own and reflect my voice.
The Jam was another English band from around the same era, although they technically categorized as a mod band. A band that was in the same artistic footprint as The Who.
Mr. Jones got run down. Headlines of death and sorrow, they tell of tomorrow. Madmen on the rampage, and I'm down in a Tuesday settlement.
Like other English punks, The Jam were also very deeply committed to working class values. Paul Weller was The Jam's lead singer and chief songwriter. He grew up in a council house in a town called Woking that lacked hot water or even an indoor bathroom. The Jam wrote songs about working class disillusionment, perfectly capturing the struggles and frustrations of working class youth in Thatcher's Britain. Tracks like this one, Down in the Tube Station at Midnight, from their album All Mod Cons, paints a picture of unemployment, boredom, and a lack of opportunity. Other songs like this one, The Eton Rifles, from their Setting Suns album, spoofed England's privileged class.
This next song is called Start. It's not important for you to know my name, nor I to know yours. If we communicate for 2 minutes only, it won't be enough. Knowing someone in this life, we was the desperate to be.
And beyond politics, of course, there were songs with softer emotions such as this one, Start, from their album Sound Effects. In the UK, punk was a voice agitated for the working class, protesting the lack of opportunities and the lack of support from Thatcher's government. But what do you do as a punk musician if your country's issues are not working class related? Can punk still be relevant? So take the former Soviet Union. There, workers were officially in the backbone of Soviet society, and at least in ideology. Workers took the place for something like a privileged class. A song like the Jam's Eatin' Rifles, a sarcastic poke in the eye at England's privileged snobs, was out of place in a country devoted to collectivism, equality, devotion to communist values and the Communist Party, and hatred of capitalism. In Russia, in other words, punks were pushing as hard as they could from behind the Iron Curtain against communism. Here, punk grew out of the educated class from what the English would have called bourgeois circles. In the USSR, the first wave of punk fans and musicians were people with university degrees in the sciences, engineering, journalism, and so on. It was like roles had been swapped. Russian punks thought that workers were lazy, uneducated slobs who made life impossible for the oppressed intellectuals, saw anyone with an education as a parasite, serving no useful purpose. Soviet culture excluded and devalued anyone who openly contradicted the official stance about the way that things should be. So if you saw a unique path for yourself, if you were a creative thinker, if you had an interest in Western capitalist culture, or you weren't exactly overflowing with love of communist ideas, you might have fit in just fine with the Russian punks. The most influential of these bands was called Grazdanskaya Oborona, which translates in English as civil defense. The lead singer was Egor Letov. His brother, Sergei, shares a story about Egor's first visit to Moscow, which goes like this. New to Moscow, Egor was taking a train to a place outside the city, and he got out at a station called Fraser. A group of young guys came over and started hassling Egor. Teasing him about his glasses, one of the workers grabbed him and broke them, and in defiance, Egor refuses to ever replace them or even have them repaired. In protest, he went around for a long time with a big triangular piece of broken glass in the frames where the lens had used to be. And I suppose it made a point. Egor chose to wear the reminder of how he'd been beaten as his form of protest about a society he was sure had gone wrong. is Grazdanskaya Oborona's song, translated into English, Insects. Even without knowing the words, you can still hear the anger in this music. But let me translate for you, to sharpen the focus, and as you listen, think about this. This band came from a small town in bitter cold, punishing Siberia, where the Russian gulags were still part of the landscape, in a country where the party had turned neighbors on neighbors and children on parents, until the point in Stalin's government where they had murdered 21 million people. The icy glaze has trampled my paths. The gun has chewed up my laughs. The insects are hoarding shame. The insects are hoarding jealousy. The pity squeaked between the teeth. The meat cried under the knife. The insects are squirming. The insects are squirming. Shit doesn't stink in fire and blood. Honest and respectable people everywhere. Everyone was born a cop. Everyone was born a cop. The padded jackets heed lessons and courage. The borscht is smirking like a crapper wide open. An insect can endure everything. Self-control is self-control. A brave new world. A brave new play. Apotheosis, which is the pinnacle of achievement. Apotheosis. Meandering through the weeds, they froze to death. Meandering through the weeds, they froze to death. They froze to death. Both of God's servants, they're you and I. Both of God's servants, they're you and I. That's how it was. That's how it was. That's how it was. That's how it was. Forever and ever. Forever and ever. In the name of the puppy and the crumpled piece of paper, I invoke the dry little river, the dead little birdie, the great gaping flame, the charred grimy rock, to deliver us from the efforts of evil, from the eyes of meat, from the speeches of stone, the museums of plenty, and the boozy remarks from the proletarian masses and all other life. The icy glaze has trampled my laughs. The machine gun has chewed up my laughs. Insects. Like the story about the broken glasses, Egor is sharing his heart about his country. The people he thought his government saw as insects. Once again, plain truth as open protest. But it needs to be said. Soviet-era music was rarely political like this. Regardless, Soviet authorities still felt that the aggression and the abandon in the music went outside what was normally allowable in Soviet society. Songs like Insects proved the worries Soviet leaders had since the 1950s and the rise of rock were well-founded. If young people in the USSR were exposed to the revolutionary sounds coming from America, the government would lose control if people chose to revolt against oppression. The censors put up formidable walls to keep books, films, magazines, and music out. This opened up a huge black market for this dangerous contraband. At the time, many Russian homes had reel-to-reel tape decks, and these were used to supply the black market with magnesitat, which was lo-fi bootlegs that quietly fed a market gasping for the fresh air of freedom and kept alive by the knowledge that it was out there somewhere in the world and possibly coming to them someday soon. Soon, Soviet groups began to distribute their own music through the black market tape scene, especially with groundbreaking punk groups like Automoticheski, Udovlo Rebellion. You're listening to that band now. Their leader was Andrei Panov, who went by Svin, which means the swine. And I saw a translated interview with Panov where he said, "There's nothing worse than what we play. And no one can deny that we're proper loafers. We are not punk people, only funnily misbehaving. Remember, we are ordinary people. You may say we are cute and intelligent. We can find a common language with any group. At a beer stand, we are as one with them, and we beat up intellectuals. So in Panov, you've got the other side of the intellectual versus worker antagonism. Panov was as provocative as Johnny Rotten, for instance. He had an over-the-top reputation as a public drunk, and his behavior led to the band being barred from Leningrad's rock club scene. The band started in '79, and their early gigs were at apartment parties in Leningrad, once again now called St. Petersburg. By 1982, they were also playing in Moscow. So they were a regional band. These cities are about 400 miles apart or so, about a day's drive, but they were an underground band with a cult following. The Leningrad Rock Club was a club that became the breeding ground for the USSR's rock scene. It was the idea of a KGB agent who thought that allowing a state-sanctioned music club was the way to control the music and the impact it would have, which turned out to be like trying to control lightning by holding it in your hand. In practice, what you had was the KGB on one side, watching the audience and monitoring the band's lyrics, and on the other side, a group of students called the Komsomol, who knew the music scene and brought in the hottest acts of the time. This recognition lifted the band to a level that allowed them to perform in official rock festivals for the first time. Automoticheski recorded their first punk record in USSR live at a gig, and using a single mic. The resulting album was titled, appropriately enough, First Time in Moscow. Their song was not at all political, but their attitude was way outside the Soviet boundaries. Here's their song Yerunda, or Nonsense. In English, the lyrics are, I've been going crazy all day, but there's only one reason I can't divide myself. I don't know what to do. Nonsense, 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 nonsense. All day long with this mane propped up. I'm being rebellious. For one reason, I don't know myself why. Nonsense, 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 nonsense. I'm losing my temper and I'm almost going crazy unloading the gun. Rave. Nonsense, 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 nonsense. In the late 1970s, South Africa was a country mired in a tangle of Jim Crow laws that have separated blacks from whites in a system called apartheid. This was the law of the land between 1948 and 1994. The system forcibly moved blacks off of their tribal lands and into slums called townships. To keep these laws in place and to control the native black population, South Africa's Dutch colonizers relied on violence and terror. Knowing that education was the key to forward progress, the Dutch Afrikaners provided South African blacks with very little education. Taking their cue from the other repressive regimes like the USSR, the government censored all forms of media, including music. And when black and white teenagers started expressing their frustration with the apartheid government's policies, it lit a long fuse which led to explosive change and the eventual end of white colonial rule in that country. Once again, rock and punk provided the downbeat. The first of South Africa's punk bands to really make it big was called Fuck Off Poliskar. Their solution to their country's problems came down to destruction with songs like this one, Burn South Africa. They gave South Africa's thoroughly pissed off youth something they could relate to.
Mense wat wag in die bosse buite jou huis in die nag. Ons sal mos veilig wees, ons sal mos veilig wees. Ons sou ons gewete skoon, ons lyk toe die deur.
In English, the lyrics go, "There are more knives waiting for you in the woods outside your house at night. We will be safe. We will be safe. We keep our consciences clear. Then we close the door. We took petrol. And we burned all our bridges before we were on the other side. And all I realize now, and all I realize only now, blood and iron, blood and soil, blood and oil, blood and soil." Scared and lazy and desperate, there is nothing new under the sun. And in the shade, Burn South Africa. What do I know about being dishonest? My conscience seeps through. My waking life is this old man's memory. And I realize now, and I realize only now, blood and iron, blood and soil, blood and oil, blood and soil. Scared and lazy and desperate, there is nothing new under the sun. And in the shade, Burn South Africa. And I realize now, and I realize only now, the Osewa Fire Brigade blew up the city last night. Blood and iron, blood and soil, blood and oil, blood and soil. Scared and lazy and desperate, there is nothing new under the sun. And in the shade, burn South Africa. And us for you, and us for you, landmines of guilt in a one-man concentration camp. You complain about the state of our country? Well, fucking do something about it. Burn South Africa. The band was also strongly anti-religion, too, which also gave South African parents, not to mention the church and the authorities, more reasons to hate the band, which of course meant the kids loved them even more, right? Newspaper clippings from back in the day tell the story really well. Straight to hell, Fuck Off Poliskar rocks church. Fuck Off divides church. Rebel rockers, Poliskar in trouble after member blasphemes. Controversial Africans band suffers Christians' wrath. Dutch Reformed Church asks for calm in struggle over police car. Fuck Off inspired a legion of other bands who followed in their footsteps. One of these was the Kalahari Surfers, who incorporated South African rhythms into their sound. I really like this song, Limpet Mine. The minimalist hip-hop beat and the ragged tooth vocals captured the time and place and pulled no punches. With songs like this one, the Kalahari Surfers held up a mirror to their nation, showing everyone how ugly the reflection was. A limpet mine is a type of a military explosive, and the song ends with a warning. We are limpet mines, yellow at heart, living in a country that's blowing apart. The Kalahari Surfers were not a proper band. It was a project by a musician named Warwick Sony, something like the Gorillaz or Danger Mouse would be today. A Hindu pacifist living in a country under the boot heel of a repressive regime, where censorship was intense. He still found a way around the censors using a style called plunderphonics. And I actually talked about this in my episode about musique concrete back in December of 2021. Once again, there's a link to that in the show notes today. Warwick flew under the radar with the band's name, too. Everything was published under false names. Even the identities of any guest artists. The authorities can't arrest you if they can't find you. The author, Mary Ellison, put it this way: when songs are sung about oppression, whether it's channeled through racism, poverty, or brutality, they're elementally dangerous because they're exposing the reality of situations that those in power would prefer to be masked. Songs that strip away illusions and show things as they are subversive simply because they tell the truth. In societies structured around discrimination, nothing is more subversive than the truth. Band National Wave was one of the earliest South African punk bands and came together in 1978. Members included a Jewish architect student named Ivan Cady from Johannesburg and another white musician named Steve Money, who also played guitar. Two brothers, Gary and Punka Koza from the Black Township of Soweto, played bass and drums respectively. The guys all met while playing an underground jam session. Taking an opposite approach to the Kalahari Surfers, National Awake absolutely did not hide from the censors. Being the first black, white, integrated band in the country, they used their music to add more power to the anti-apartheid movement. Their one and only self-titled album was released in 1981. It only sold around 700 copies before the government ordered it removed from retail shelves, claiming the band was a subversive threat. We're listening to their song, International News, which was about military atrocities during the war in Angola. Although my mind would have been on the band, I guess you could say that the authorities were right. Elsewhere, the band's been described as maybe the most dissident music scene of the 20th century, a multiracial punk band in a fascist police state. Ultimately, South African punk played an indirect but important role in the fight against apartheid. As we've seen, it challenged the status quo. It was anti-establishment from the word go, fueled by punk's DIY ethos, and the young South Africans were encouraged to create their own music outside the government-controlled mainstream. Also, integrated bands like National Wake pushed for racial unity across the nation. Underground clubs also provided opportunities for integrated gatherings of black and white kids to share the same experiences. And you can tell from the tracks that I've been sharing that a number of these songs were written in Afrikaans and not English, making the heavy messages in the music plain for all to hear.
This is my last message addressed to the people of South Africa. To my dear wife and family, I will say goodbye in a different way. Our country faces so many challenges of a serious nature. I hold firm opinions about all of them, but decided to keep this message very short and only really focus on two issues. Therefore, let me today, in this last message, repeat. I, without qualification, apologize for the pain and the hurt and the indignity and the damage that apartheid has done to black, brown, and Indians in South Africa. I do so not only in my capacity as the former leader of the National Party, but also as an individual. My conversion, to which I refer, didn't end with the admission to myself of the total unacceptability of apartheid. It motivated us in the National Party to take the initiatives we took. From the time that I became leader of the National Party, and more specifically during my presidency, together with most other South Africans, I'm proud of our Constitution. The Constitution which we hammered out in the negotiations which started in 1990 and which culminated in the final Constitution of 1996. I fully associate myself with the values and principles enshrined in our Constitution. And I'm deeply concerned about the undermining of many aspects of the Constitution, which we perceive almost day to day. The road forward is a difficult one. But I firmly believe that if we take hands, and if all the reasonable people in South Africa put their heads together, we can overcome the challenges we face, and we can fulfill the tremendous potential that South Africa has. May the South African nation show the courage and the ingenuity to achieve this.
Punk rock and the punk movement was the tiny snowball that became a major avalanche in the freeing of East Germany from communist repression. From the beginning, the freedom of expression and individualism of Western music, starting with jazz and progressing all the way through every evolution that followed, was at odds with the repression and thought control that a totalitarian state like East Germany or the USSR uses to control its people. The Stasi, that was East Germany's notorious secret police, saw the messages in the music as a threat to the status quo. Punk was the most extreme. Beginning in the early 80s, the Protestant church decided to embrace punk as a way to call the kids back to the church, and this gave the snowball momentum. For the Stasi, the state and the church were in conflict, so more kids getting involved in church events wasn't necessarily a good thing. Official Stasi files from the time included reports about how punk participation in the church was on the rise. Likewise, the Stasi believed that the church itself was in league with the punk movement. One example is a band called Nominals. Formed in the spring of 1983 by four young men named Michael Hoschig, Jana Schlosser, Mita Schamel, and Frank Mosch. Like other punk bands from the GDR, Nominals played gigs. They called them blues masses, from behind the protective walls of the Protestant church. Their gigs, these blues masses, were a mashup of worship, theater, sermons, rock, and blues music. Playing in the church, these bands were able to do what they could not do anywhere else in the repressive GDR, i.e. speak their mind and behave in ways that were counter to official East German values. And while there wasn't anything in the Stasi directly could do to stop them, they did show up to the gigs. And they took notes. And those notes went into official files. See, Stasi files are filled with notes about song lyrics that were highly critical of the state. There were songs about the negative influence of the Soviet Republic. Roten Parolen und Sausche Macht haben Deutschland kaputt gemacht. Which means red slogans and Soviet power have destroyed Germany. Not what I would call subtle. An escalating number of right-wing extremists, Nazi Schwein in Ostberlin, which meant Nazi pigs in East Berlin, probably not a song title that made too many Stasi members real happy. Eventually, criminal charges were brought against the band members. Of course, communist regimes had always tried to control the in rock. This had been going on since the 40s, since jazz, and labels like Antisocial Rowdies had always been hung on anyone playing or even just listening to forbidden music, described as East Bloc authorities considered every new direction in music to be the product of the capitalist entertainment industry, pouring out of the morally decadent West. By November 1983, the Stasi had built files on no fewer than 900 kids across the entire GDR. East Germany believed that the West was attacking communism by changing the way their youth was being made to feel about their own society. When you read the Stasi training manuals, and you get an idea of why they would believe this. In 1981, the General Secretary of the Socialist Union Party, a guy named Erich Honecker, he wrote, "In our society, the party and the young people are one, because the idea of socialism with its aims of peace and prosperity correlates with the ideals of the young generation. It offers all youngsters the perspective of a secure future. Socialism needs the youth, and the young generation needs socialism." Pretty obviously, the plan was to control the future by producing a future generations of socialist workers and leaders. In Honecker, you can see right away why the Stasi felt it was in competition with the church. Both the party and the church understood that their future is totally dependent on how well they capture the hearts and minds of the same people. Both wanted to be the dominant force in their lives, but there's only room for one at the top. Also, punks were a shock to the East German system, something the state hadn't factored into their plans and theories. Labeled as lacking discipline, showing aggressive behavior, being confrontational, glorifying individualism, and demanding absolute personal freedom, and rejecting any form of authority. Punks were a threat to the carefully balanced house of cards that was the GDR. If the government lost control of one social group, others could follow, and the entire system could topple. The Stasi didn't like what punks were saying about the state in these blues masses. Trying to shut the flow off at the main, they compiled a list of crimes that were being regularly committed at these blues masses.
Libel against the state, opposition to state regulation, impairment of state and social activity, hooliganism, and riot.
All of this boiled down to the biggest crime of all, though:
antisocial behavior.
Starting in the 1950s, East Bloc nations committed to a program of re-educating the masses. Antisocial behavior was in conflict with what you might call the
10 Commandments of Socialist Morality.
They went something like this. Number 1. All your motivation and effort should be spent on building up the working class and all workers in all socialist nations. Number 2. You will love and defend your nation with all your strength and all your abilities. Number 3. You will be personally dedicated to stop the exploitation of your fellow man. And number 4. You will raise your own kids in the spirit of socialism, focusing on strength of mental and physical strength. And blah, 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 blah. Individualism, anarchy, personal expression, etc. You know, the calling cards of the punk movement. These values just didn't fit the vision that socialist leaders had in mind. In East Germany, the education system was totally devoted to turning young East German teens into hard-working, tax-paying, world-changing young socialists. So were the media, sports, even the family. All these things were tools of the state to willfully bend and shape society into a specific kind of a future. When the Stasi labeled the punks antisocial, what they meant was that the punks were actively resisting the pressure to conform, to become state-controlled socialist puppets. What the Stasi and the state never counted on, though, was how punk, the music, clothes, and philosophy, would get smuggled across the Berlin Wall. And it was in the form of Western news, smuggled records, DIY punk fanzines, and foreign radio broadcasts.
So I have to do it, it's the big wash.
And a haunting answer to an earlier question. Was there a Russian fable that might explain to an American child why Gorbachev, so popular in our country, was being forced out of office in his?
Centuries ago, there was a young ruler in the Orient, and he wanted to rule in a different way, in a more human way, in his kingdom. And he asked the views of the wise men. And it took 10 years to bring 20 carts with volumes of advice. He said, when am I going to read all that? I have to govern my country. 10 years later, they brought him just 10 volumes of advice. He said, that too is too much. 5 years later, he was brought just one volume, small volume. But unfortunately, 25 years had passed and he was on his deathbed. And when the wise man looked at the book, he didn't even give the book to that dying man. He said, well, all in all that is here can be summarized in a simple formula. People are born, people suffer, and people die.
People are born, people suffer, and people die. Mikhail Gorbachev would live another 30 years, widely admired throughout much of the world for bringing an end to a communist Soviet Union. But Gorbachev was mostly ignored and sometimes even reviled at home for the very things that made him so popular in the West.
Punk was suddenly introducing the promise of things that weren't possible in their repressed world. It brought something new, shocking, chaotic, spontaneous, and fun into the gray world of socialism. And not a moment too soon, if you ask me. When I was doing the back work for this episode, I read an interview where one punk said that this whole upbringing to become a machine, the whole state-run youth scene, makes me sick. There's nothing there. So boring. When I think about our discotheques, I think puke. In a culture that lifted regular working people up as culture heroes, your typical punk's dislike for the collective workforce was another shock to the system. Punks totally refused the boring routine of daily factory work or working on collective farms and belonging to trade unions. Another East German punk named Thomas Bautzer worked as a dockhand, and he said, I had to go to work, get up at 4:30 every day, 6 o'clock at the dock, every day the same idiot, an old repulsive old man who I had to spend the whole day with. It made me feel sick. A punk who calls himself Chaos worked as a carpenter's apprentice. He said, no matter what happens, I will not end up like that, in that pack of lemmings, pissing my life away in this gray hellhole, everyone informing on each other, everyone working for nothing, and then keeling over at 70. No way. No fucking way. Inspired by what they saw on the fanzines and album covers, the GDR's punks adopted the same punk fashions that had started out in Malcolm McLaren's fashion store. Another punk named Colonel said, we would have stuck a picture of Adolf Hitler or Lenin on our jackets, but only to shock people. Not because we were communists or fascists. We were punks. We were outsiders. We wanted to shock. They gave themselves piercings with safety pins and other hardware, and ran them through their noses, ears, and cheeks. The band names were meant to shock too. Schleimkleim, which meant slimy germs, planlos, no plans, Wutenfall, tantrum, and Rose Extra, an East German brand of sanitary napkins. East German punk was similar to what was coming out of the UK, Russia, and South Africa at the time. Here's an example from Schleimkeim. called Frugelnaben or Baton Boy. I'll translate some of the lyrics for you. We don't want the way you want it anymore. We want our freedom. We are the people. We are the power. We demand justice. We are the people. We are the power. Namenlos, like the other punk bands, made their music in a soundproofed basement, places where they could vent their just barely contained frustrations without getting busted. The Stasi moved to clamp down on the punk movement with arrests, preventive detentions, prison sentences in the draft. The official punk policy was target the punks and destroy the movement. Punks were beaten and tortured. Here's the personal account from one of the punks who got caught up in this chaos. Quote, "The police stormed in. They locked us all in a room and then chose one and took him into the kitchen where he was beaten up by several pigs. They grabbed the next one and dragged him into the kitchen. By the time it was over, they had beaten up and taken away everybody, including the girls. During the journey to the police station, they were beaten on the back seats of the huge numbers of buses and vans that had turned up, and then for half the night in the police station, they were threatened and beaten. I came home late that day and I found the flat in a catastrophic state. The whole kitchen, cupboards, curtains, cooker, walls, and even the ceilings were splattered with blood. The people who had been beaten up there were between 15 and 18 years of age. On top of that, the Stasi infiltrated the punk scene with undercover agents. Even the bands themselves were filled with members writing reports on each other. For instance, the Stasi declared Chaos, the lead singer of the band Wutenfall, as public enemy number 1. And then they began keeping super detailed records of his movements, meetings, and conversations across the GDR. Most of this information was reported to the Stasi by Chaos's best friend, a guy named Zappa, who, by the way, was also the band's bass player. The Stasi threatened him into cooperating. Chaos's defiance against the state ended after one gruesome encounter. The Stasi detained him and they put a bag over his head. They forced him into a car and they drove around for a while before dragging him out into the woods at gunpoint. There, he was savagely beaten up and kicked around, finally covered in hematoma and splattered with blood. They hauled him back into the Stasi station house and they forced him to sign an official statement that said he'd been treated with respect during his detainment. This period was pretty much the low point. Remember, the GDR took its direction from the USSR. And these were the days of Gorbachev and Glasnost. So in 1988, the East German authorities decided it was time to play nice again. The punks were allowed to apply for permits and authorized to perform at official events. It was sort of a, if you can't beat them, tolerate them kind of strategy. And by the late 1980s, it was clear that the Stasi's attitude towards the punks had changed. In fact, once registered with the state, punk bands could even draw a state salary. Suddenly, opportunities were opening up for the punks, but they'd been, limited to playing for small crowds inside church halls. Suddenly, they were all over the media, recording albums in state-owned studios, getting airplay on state-owned radio stations, playing huge concerts in major cities like Berlin. The goal was to defang the beast by pulling the politics out of punk. Good news for the East Germans, bad news for the GDR. What happened next is right out of the Pandora's box myth. The one where the gods gave the world's first woman a box she was never ever supposed to open, but curiosity gets the better of her and she opens the jar which releases all of the world's troubles. Loosening the controls confused local authorities on what the official policy towards the punks actually was. Things came to a head in October of '88 in the city of Dresden, where the local police began assaulting some punks and fining or banning others for their appearances. The confusion made it clear to not just the punks, but to literally everybody, that the party was losing control. A small movement only a snowball really, begun by a few punks and other activists, mushroomed into a massive uprising that swept up people from all walks of life. And here they all came, marching through the streets and chanting, "We are the people." On October 9th, 1989, over 100,000 protesters took to the streets in Leipzig. Erich Mielke, the head of the Stasi, ordered a state of red alert, but his boss, Egon Krenz, the Secretary of Security, ordered that the Stasi was not to forcibly intervene. There would be no lining up of armed tanks like at Tiananmen Square. The GDR didn't want their own version of that atrocity. These were the days of Mikhail Gorbachev and Glasnost. Without opposition, the protesters staged a peaceful demonstration. 2 weeks later, following the successful protest, the Politburo, the ultimate decision-making authority throughout communist Eastern Europe, ousted East Germany's party leader Erich Honecker. 4 months later, the Berlin Wall fell, and the East German communist dictatorship was no more. A moment marked by the first ever free elections in the GDR.
On Sunday morning, it began again. A new checkpoint was opened, thousands of people poured across the wall, and thousands of other people waited in the damp cold to greet them. Emotion was everywhere, as far as the eye could see. The wall was open, and one young man eloquently summed up the feeling that only the oppressed can truly know, that freedom is what it's all about.
The greatest. Freedom is the greatest.
The greatest.
For me. For us.
Wiedersehen.
What were once merely peepholes to the east have now become enormous gateways to the west, paved on a foundation of freedom through a crumbling Berlin Wall. Amidst the welcoming cheers and tears of a nation, hundreds of thousands of East Germans are making the historic journey across the border into West Berlin. For many, like Hagen Hoffman and his family, it is the first time, and the moment is overwhelming.
It's a beautiful day for us. I'm only 27 years old, but it's fantastic that we and our children can go in all around the world.
For Hagen Hoffman, an environmentalist, his little 5-year-old Gregor and wife Ina, these are their first steps on Western soil, the realization of a lifelong dream born beyond the shadow of concrete captivity.
Coming out of a few clubs in New York and Los Angeles, punk gave the next generation a way to voice their concerns in a way that pretty accurately described the times. Coming from the streets, punk gave cry to the local needs of the people, and that changed in every time and place. The miracle of the story, though, to me, is how mere music could have changed the world in the immense way that it did. And here's my sincere hope for my listeners on this podcast, that you would allow or continue to allow music to continue to speak like that to you today. And remember, quality over quantity. You can continue to connect with American Song on Facebook. Just go to American Song Podcast at facebook.com. This has been Joe Hines for American Song, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you next time. Thank you so much.
Could stand up, we must never be silenced. We gotta speak up now for all our sakes.